All right, so welcome back. In this video, we're going to actually do a few examples of triggering some JavaScript code. In the previous video, we talked about the 3 different ways of incorporating JavaScript or integrating JavaScript. We can do it inline, which is with these event attributes. And so the next slide, it shows you a series of event attributes that we can use to trigger our code. And we'll do, like I said, we'll do a few examples of that. We can do internal, which is basically using the script tags, and you would typically place that at the bottom of your document. The script tags can also be found within the head of our document. And then there's external, where you create a separate JavaScript file and you'll place all of your code, all your statements in that file. There's one, when you're doing internal, there is this defer attribute that you can actually use. And the defer attribute is, what it does here, it says, load up the HTML document, right? And so if this script tag was in the head of our document, so for instance, let's go and put this defer attribute. I'm going to pull up our editor. All right, so this is the sheet that we worked on, or the document that we generated in our last video. So if we put this defer attribute here in our code, and I'll make this bigger here so you can actually see it. There we go. What this is saying here is in the head of our document, right? The way the JavaScript engine is going to read this document is from top to bottom, starting on line 1, and it'll go all the way down to line 17. All right. And like I said, typically you will want to have your script tags at the bottom right before the close and body tag. Reason being is because there's some HTML or HTML statements that you will want to render first before your code is ran. But if you were to put all of this code in an external document and you have the defer attribute, this allows the document, if you have, the JavaScript engine is going to look at this defer attribute, it's going to load the document, right, the entire document, and then it'll come back to the script tag and run the code. And so this allows us, or alleviates us, from actually having to put it at the bottom of our document, and we can just go ahead and put all of our code here within our head. But we want to use the defer attribute so that it's the last thing that would actually be rendered once the HTML document is loaded in the browser. So that's what the defer attribute, purpose of the defer attribute. And here's some write-up related to that. There's also an async attribute as well, and it kind of performs some of a similar functionality. But and so yeah, it tells the browser to parse the HTML and JavaScript code together, and then defer, like I said, processes until after the web pages has been completely parsed and loaded. Here's an activity I'd like you to work on. Try to complete this. We're going to work through this during our time together, and this is going to be extra credit. But take a step at this activity, see if you can get through it. It's a simple activity in terms of how to implement JavaScript and then triggering some CSS code here using JavaScript. So there is an error in this code. To fix this, you would just basically go here, put a single colon, right? Reason being is because you have the double quotations here, right? And so if you have you can't use the double quotations within. If you've already used them in the outer bounds, you have to use single quotations. Because if you use double quotations, it would end the it would imply that you're ending the statement here after. So if this was double quoted, it would imply that you're ending the statement after this open parenthesis. So go ahead and pause this video, take a stab at this, and like I said, this will be extra credit and good activities to kind of practice some of the things that we just went over. All right, so here's how to add comments. So here's a single line comment, and then here's a block comment. It's very similar. This is very similar to what you would do in CSS, and also the majority of languages out there. This is how you would notate a block comment with a / asterisk, and we're gonna do a few examples of this in just a second as well. There are a few reserved keywords that you cannot use as variables, and these are these words here on the right. Every language has reserved keywords. That's how they construct the language and how we build the syntax for the language. And so words such as if and else and do and char and class, those are reserved keywords. We cannot declare variables, right? And we'll come back to this slide here in terms of declaring data types. But let's go and actually get some practice and triggering some JavaScript. So we're going to bring up our HTML document. And what I'm going to do here first is I'm going to comment out my internal JavaScript. And I'm going to, I can keep the script tag there, that's fine. But let's go and see how this functions here. And I'm going to add a little bit of internal CSS here just to, so I'll do style, right? And then I'll just target my div element. So I'll say div. I'll give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, color, white, background color, red, and then what I'll also do is just do text align, and I'll do center. All right. Let's do the font size. So I'm just giving some definition to this button here. All right. And the only thing I want you to observe is this on click. So let's save it. All right. And let's go and render our document in the browser. All right. So here's our button with the click me. So if I click it, watch what happens. It's going to be a window.alert. Right. And the event that was triggered was the on click. All right. Now let's go back to our document here. We can also do something called an on mouse over. Now you're not going to see much difference here, but on mouse. And so if I save it, it's another event attribute. Now refresh. Now watch this here. I'm going to basically scroll my mouse over this button and it should trigger the same statement. Boom. And it's triggered automatically. I don't have to click on it. So the next way of implementation is internal. So this was the inline using the various event attributes, but let's take a look at the internal here. So I'm going to comment out this line, and here I'm going to uncomment our internal JavaScript. Let me just say a few words about what is happening here. So this document that gives us by ID, gives us by tag name, is a function that's a part of the document object. It takes in an argument. One of the arguments that it takes in is the name of the element that it wants to target. In this case, it's going to get elements, the key word here being elements, right? It's going to get all of the elements that are div elements. And then here it's saying get the first element in that. They're going to put it into a list, an array, get the first element in that list, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to add an event listener. So once somebody clicks on that first element in our document, it's going to put some text into the opening and closing div tag of the first one. It's going to put triggered by internal JavaScript. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to uncomment this. I'm going to get rid of this event attribute. And let's see the functionality of what's going to happen here, right? We only have one div element in our document, so it's going to target only only div element on line 19. So let's save it, and then let's go and re-render it in our browser. All right. So watch what happens when I click on this. Right? It changes the text. Right? So let me refresh. So it says click me, but then we can change the text. And what's allowing us to change that text is a property from the document object, document object called inner.html. Like I said, this is pretty, if you haven't seen JavaScript, this may be a little much here, right? But hopefully after the next 3 weeks, this will make a lot more sense. Anyway, that's an example of internal JavaScript. Now we could take the same statement here, right? And we could paste it inside of an external file here. We'll paste it and we'll get rid of it from here. And we'll save it, right? So we have our external statement that links to this script.js file. This is the relative file path. And we gave it script.js because it's within the root of the file of JS1. So if we save this and then we save the script file here as well, right, it should still function the same. So if we refresh here, right, so if I click on this, everything still works the same. It's just that the only thing that's different is that I'm basically referencing this JavaScript file. I'm referencing the code from an external file. And the way the scripting engine or the browser engine, once it sees the code, it doesn't actually see that it doesn't know that it's in a separate file. It sees it. It would actually kind of treat it as though it's all in the same file, right? This script tag is only for our use, what makes it easier for us, for lack of better words, right? But the scripting engine that reads the code within the browser does not know that it's in a separate file. We just told it that it was in a separate file, right? But these here are just to help us kind of break up the code and put them to separate files for maintainability and for kind of modularizing our code in a sense. So let's talk about a few more concepts and then we're going to end this video. The last thing I want to talk about here is something called data types. So data types, there's kind of two categories. There's what we call primitive data types and there's what we call non-primitive data types. So primitive data types are what we, in a sense, are ones that are built into the language. And there are 5 that we know of: is numbers, strings, Boolean, null, and undefined. And then there's composite, or ones that we build that are not necessarily native to the language, but that we can construct ourselves. So there's arrays and something called objects. And we'll get into objects and arrays towards the end of our understanding of JavaScript. So here's kind of a definition of each string. You use with the quotations. And so let's just actually do an example of these here. And we're going to do this internal. So if I have my script tags here, one of the things we're going to talk about is declaring a variable. Right? When you declare a variable, you'll say var in JavaScript. You can also use the keyword let. You can also use the keyword const. And we'll talk about the difference between var, let, and const. But let's go and use var. And then when you declare a variable, you have to give it a name, right? So if we said, let's say var, and we say student, right? And the student is going to be equal to, let's just say Joe, right? So what I've just done here was that I've actually declared a variable and initialized it. And the idea of declaring a variable is that you're going to declare a variable so that a value can be stored into that variable. And that's kind of what you're doing when you're doing computer programming. Is when you want to hold data in something, you have to declare a variable so that that data can be held within your program. So that's a string. A single line comment. Let's do another one here. So this would be a numeric value or a number or integer value. We say age. And let's just say 55. Now notice that I didn't put quotations. Whenever you're declaring a numeric value, you don't have to put you shouldn't put the quotations, right? It should just be the numeric value. And that's what distinguishes a string from a numeric value. Right? So this would be or integer. I spelled integer wrong there. Another one would be Boolean. So we could say var, right, is found. You could say equals to true, or we could say false, right? And it would be all lowercase, right? Another one is null. So you can say var institution equals null, right? And if we put null, it's basically saying there's no value, that there's an empty value. There's nothing that that is taken. It's a variable that's declared, but it currently is set to null, no value. Some of the other data types here that you will find is you have undefined, which is essentially that it's undeclared, right? It's not assigned, right? It's unassigned. And so what does that look like? So var, we could say semester, right? So that's what that would look like. It's undefined. It's not assigned to anything. Now we did this all in a single step, but one of the things that you can do is take a 2-step approach and say var student. So student is undefined currently, but then if you want to, you could go ahead and say now we can assign student is equal to Joe, and that would be permissible as well, right? Now, there were some what we call composite or non-primitive data types. That there was 2 different types of data types. There's objects and arrays, And so with an array, which we're going to talk a little bit more about a little bit later, but with an array, it's essentially, you can kind of create a list, right? So we can say var textbooks, and we can declare an array. So if you had a list of items, you can put it into what we call an array. We could say math book. Let's just say we had 3 items. Comp sci book. And let's just say networking, right? And so an array holds a list of items. In this case, it's going to hold a list of our textbooks. Notice the syntax here. Now it's going to be string data type, right? And we separate the items in our list using a comma, right? One of the things I also want to point out is that each statement ends with a semicolon, right? So in JavaScript, whenever you want to end a statement, end it with a semicolon, right? So these are some of the different data types that are permissible. There was another one called an object, and I'll show you what that looks like. And so if we said var student, and the way object is declared is if you use these squiggly brackets. And with the object, it typically represents a person, place, thing, and sometimes an idea. You can put name. Watch this here. We could put student. Well, let's put age. Is found. Institution. Semester. In this case, we could put semester equals null. And if we wanted to, we can also do the array, right? But notice that this object contains a series of attributes or key value pairs, and some people would say, right? The key will be name and the value will be Joe. The key is age, the value will be 55. And so an object, we can actually contain all of this information and really make it into one particular student, and all this data is carried for this student object, a student. So that's an object, right? And we'll talk more about objects later in this video series. So nonetheless, I don't want to make this video too long, right? This is how we declare variables, right? And here on line 22 is a one-step process where we declare and initialize. We declare that it's a student, right? And then we initialize it to Joe. So student is now holding the value Joe, right? Or we can break that process up into 2 steps where we declare, right? And then we initialize on line 24. And then line 25 is a numeric data type. Line 26 is Boolean. 27 is null. 28 is undefined. 29 is an array. 30 is an object. And objects have the ability to carry multiple pieces of data that represents a person, place, or thing, or sometimes an idea. And one small correction here is that I see that on line 33, I forgot to do a colon, and that's one small error there, so that's fixed. Hey, like I said, I don't want to make this video too long. Let's wrap it up here. In our next video, we'll dive more into objects and the objects that JavaScript provides for us, and we'll get some more practice with writing some actual scripts using our own defined variables, and then also using some of the built-in objects and some of the methods and properties found within those objects. Stay tuned.